From Secret Crush to Live TV Confrontation, nobody was ready for this moment. The studio lights burned bright that Tuesday afternoon, casting their familiar glow across the iconic set of The View, where 5 women had gathered around their table like they had thousands of times before. But what was about to unfold in the next 17 minutes would shatter the carefully constructed facade of daytime television civility and expose a wound that had been festering for decades. Joy Behar sat in her usual seat, coffee mug in hand, her sharp wit primed and ready for another day of political sparring and celebrity interviews. She had no idea that the man walking onto that stage, the man she'd once whispered about in green rooms and admired from afar, was about to become her most unforgettable adversary. Before we dive into this absolutely insane confrontation, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Prime Talk right now, because we bring you the most explosive celebrity moments that everyone else is too scared to cover. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling us whose side you're on, and let's get into this unbelievable story that had social media absolutely losing its mind. Liam Neeson. The name alone conjures images of gravitas, intensity, and that unmistakable voice that has narrated both tender love stories and brutal revenge sagas. At 71 years old, he remained every bit the commanding presence he'd been in his prime, tall, weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of Irish storytelling tradition. When his publicist had pitched the View appearance to promote his latest thriller, it seemed like a standard publicity stop. A few laughs, some stories about the film, maybe a charming anecdote about his grandchildren. Standard fare for the daytime circuit. What nobody in that room knew, what the producers couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that Joy Behar had been carrying something heavy in her heart for more than 20 years. The audience applauded as Neeson walked out, his movements still graceful despite the years. He shook hands with each host, offering that gentleman's smile that had melted hearts since his breakout role in the 80s. When he reached Joy, there was the briefest hesitation, a flicker of something in both their eyes that the cameras almost missed. Almost. But this was live television, and nothing truly disappears when millions are watching. Liam, welcome back, Joy said, her voice carrying that familiar New York edge, though something else lurked beneath it. It's been 5 years since you were here? Has it been that long? Neeson settled into the guest chair, his frame seeming to dwarf the furniture. Time is a cruel master, isn't it? Though I must say, Joy, you haven't aged a day. The audience cooed at the compliment. Standard banter. Safe territory. But Joy's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and those who knew her well might have recognized the tightness around her mouth, the tell that something was brewing beneath the surface. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. Questions about the new film, a funny story about a stunt gone wrong, discussion of his late wife Natasha Richardson that brought appropriate solemnity to the conversation. The other hosts chimed in with their questions, and Neeson handled everything with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times. But then Whoopi Goldberg, perhaps sensing an undercurrent she couldn't quite name, made an offhand comment that would detonate the entire segment. You know, Liam, Whoopi said with a grin. I was talking to Joy before the show, and she mentioned you two go way back. Is there some history we don't know about? The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Neeson's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around his jaw, a new wariness in his gaze. Joy's hand gripped her coffee mug so hard her knuckles went white. We've crossed paths, Neeson said carefully, his accent seeming to thicken slightly. The entertainment world can be surprisingly small. That's one way to put it, Joy said, and now there was no mistaking the edge in her voice. The audience felt it too, that electric charge that fills a room when conflict is about to erupt. Though I'd say we did more than just cross paths, wouldn't you, Liam? Sonny Hostin and Sarah Haynes exchanged glances. This wasn't in the pre-interview notes. This wasn't the scripted flow they'd discussed in the production meeting. Alyssa Farah Griffin leaned forward slightly, her political operative instincts recognizing the scent of blood in the water. Neeson's famous composure began to crack. Joy, I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue. Oh, now you're worried about appropriate venues. Joy's laugh was sharp, brittle. That's rich coming from you. Tell me, Liam, do you even remember the Shakespeare in the Park after party? Summer of 2001? Or have there been so many parties, so many women, that they all just blur together? The audience gasped. This was no longer daytime television banter. This was something raw and real and deeply personal exploding across the airwaves. The camera operators kept rolling, because what else could they do? In the control room, producers were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial, But the moment had its own terrible momentum now. Neeson's face had gone pale, then flushed. He sat up straighter, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. I remember that night perfectly well, and I also remember that we were both adults who made choices. I never promised you anything, Joy. I was clear about where I stood. Clear. Joy's voice rose, and 23 years of buried hurt came pouring out. You told me I was special. You said. She stopped herself, visibly struggling for control, aware that millions were watching this disintegration in real time. You made me believe something was possible between us, and then you disappeared. Wouldn't return my calls. Had your assistant tell me you were busy. Do you have any idea what that did to me? The confession hung in the studio air, raw and vulnerable. This wasn't the sharp-tongued comedian who'd sparred with presidents and celebrities for decades. This was a woman who'd been hurt, who'd carried that hurt like a stone in her chest, and who had finally reached her breaking point. Liam Neeson's face transformed in that moment, shifting from defensive anger to something far more complex. His Irish features, so often a mask of controlled intensity on screen, now revealed layers of emotion that no script could have captured. The audience sat in stunned silence, the kind of silence that feels loud in its completeness. Even the production assistants in the wings had frozen, watching this intimate devastation unfold with the horrified fascination of witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Joy, he began, his voice low and measured, but she cut him off with a gesture that was pure television veteran, a hand raised that commanded attention despite her smaller frame. No, Liam. You don't get to do that thing you do. That controlled, reasonable tone that makes everyone else feel like they are being hysterical. Her voice wavered but held firm. I've watched you use it in 100 interviews, deflecting anything that gets too real, too messy. But this is messy. What happened between us was messy, and you don't get to smooth it over with that famous Irish charm. Whoopi attempted to intervene, her voice calm but authoritative. Maybe we should take a breath here. I don't need a breath, Joy snapped, though her eyes never left Neeson's face. I've been holding my breath for 23 years. I've sat at this table, interviewing actors and politicians and musicians, always professional, always on point. And I've watched him from a distance, in films and interviews, winning awards and being celebrated, while I carried around this thing that he made me feel. This rejection that he never even acknowledged. The other hosts were completely silent now, understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended their usual dynamic. This wasn't political debate or celebrity gossip. This was human pain, raw and unvarnished, and it demanded space to breathe. Neeson leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his defensive posture softened. You're right, he said quietly, and the admission seemed to cost him something. You're absolutely right. I was a coward. The studio audience let out a collective breath. No one had expected capitulation, certainly not so quickly, not from a man whose entire public persona was built on strength and certainty. That summer, he continued, his accent thickening with emotion, I was coming apart. My marriage was struggling, though I wouldn't admit it to anyone, least of all myself. Natasha and I were going through something difficult, and instead of facing it like a man, I ran. I ran into distractions, into work, he gestured vaguely toward Joy, into moments that felt like escapes but were really just me being selfish and careless with other people's hearts. Joy's eyes glistened, but she refused to cry. Her makeup artist, watching from backstage, knew that look, the determination not to give the world the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. You told me your marriage was over, she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. You said you were just waiting for the right time to make it official. Was any of that true, or was it all just lines from some script you'd perfected? It felt true when I said it. Neeson ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture of such weariness that it aged him visibly. That's what I've had to live with, Joy. It felt true in that moment because I wanted it to be true. I wanted to be the man who could start fresh, who could have this connection with this brilliant, funny, extraordinary woman who made me laugh harder than I'd laughed in years. But feeling something and being brave enough to actually do it, those are very different things. Sarah Haynes, usually quick with a quip or a light-hearted observation, found herself transfixed. This was the kind of honest conversation about relationships and regret that rarely happened anywhere, let alone on live television. The vulnerability on display was almost unbearable in its intimacy. After that night, Joy said, and now her voice carried a different quality, less anger, more exhausted sadness, I waited for you to call. Days turned into weeks. I'd see your name in the trades, attached to new projects, photographed at events with Natasha, smiling like nothing had happened. And I felt like such a fool. Like I'd imagined the whole thing, the connection, the promises, the way you looked at me like I was the only person in the room. You didn't imagine it, Neeson said firmly. That connection was real. That's what made my silence so unforgivable. If it had meant nothing, that would almost be easier to explain. But it did mean something, and I was too much of a coward to face what that meant, what it would require of me to honor it. Sonny Hostin, ever the lawyer, couldn't help but probe deeper. So what happened? Why ghost her instead of just being honest? Neeson's laugh was bitter, self-directed. Because honest would have required me to admit things about myself I wasn't ready to face. It would have meant acknowledging that my marriage had real problems that couldn't be fixed by simply pretending they didn't exist. It would have meant risking everything I'd built, my family, my reputation, my sense of who I was supposed to be. And Joy, he turned back to her, his eyes pleading for understanding he knew he didn't deserve. You were too important, too real. You threatened to make me see myself clearly, and I couldn't handle that. The audience was riveted. This had transcended entertainment and become something else entirely. A public reckoning, a confession, a moment of truth that felt almost too private to be broadcast to millions. I tried to hate you, Joy admitted, her defenses crumbling now. I really did. I'd watch your movies and try to convince myself you were just another arrogant actor who used women like Kleenex. But then you'd do an interview and talk about Natasha with such love, such devotion after she died. And I'd feel this horrible mix of grief for your loss and anger that you'd given her the loyalty you couldn't give me. Even when we were, whatever we were. I gave her loyalty born of guilt, Neeson said, his voice cracking. After my behavior that summer, after nearly throwing everything away, I recommitted myself to our marriage with everything I had. And it worked, for the most part. We found our way back to each other. But the guilt never left me, Joy. And when I lost her, he stopped, visibly struggling with the memory. When she died, one of the thoughts that haunted me, among all the grief and loss, was that I'd wasted time we could have spent being honest with each other because I was too afraid to face my own weaknesses. Alyssa Farah Griffin wiped at her eyes discreetly, and she wasn't alone. The crew, the audience, even the usually unflappable Whoopi seemed moved by the brutal honesty on display. Did you ever think about reaching out? Joy asked. After she passed, did you ever think about explaining, apologizing, any of it? Neeson nodded slowly. I thought about it constantly for the first year. I'd draft emails I'd never send, rehearse phone calls I'd never make. But then time kept passing, and it felt like reaching out would be selfish, like I'd be asking you to absolve me of guilt you had no obligation to relieve. What right did I have to disrupt your life after all those years just to make myself feel better about my failures? The question hung between them like a fragile bridge, and Joy sat back in her chair, her body language shifting from confrontational to something more contemplative. The studio lights seemed to soften somehow, or perhaps it was just the collective energy in the room changing, evolving from shock into something deeper and more nuanced. Whoopi made a subtle gesture to the control room. Keep rolling. Let this play out. This was the kind of television that couldn't be scripted, shouldn't be interrupted, needed to breathe and unfold at its own pace. You know what the worst part was? Joy's voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by a weary honesty that made her sound older and younger simultaneously. It wasn't even the rejection itself. I've been rejected before. I'm a woman who came up in comedy in the 70s. Rejection was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was the silence, Liam. The absolute nothingness that followed what felt like everything. You didn't just walk away. You erased me. Like I'd never existed. Like those nights we spent talking until 3 a.m. about art and politics and our childhoods meant nothing. Like the way you held my hand in that restaurant in Brooklyn, not caring who saw us, was just some fever dream I'd invented. The specificity of her memories hit Neeson visibly. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of recognition. The restaurant with the burgundy awning. Francesco's. You ordered the mushroom risotto, and we debated whether The Sopranos was high art or just elevated mob drama. You remember, Joy breathed, and there was something almost like wonder in her voice, mixed with fresh pain. Because remembering somehow made it worse, made the abandonment more deliberate. I remember everything, Neeson said, and now there was a rawness to his confession that made it clear this wasn't performance or damage control. This was a man confronting ghosts he'd tried to outrun for more than 2 decades. I remember that you took your coffee with too much sugar and no cream. I remember that you had this habit of touching your collarbone when you were nervous. I remember the night you told me about your father and how complicated that relationship was, and I felt honored that you'd trust me with something so personal. And I remember the morning after our last night together, waking up and feeling terrified because what I felt for you was real enough to destroy everything I thought I'd built. Sarah Haynes leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. So you chose to destroy Joy instead. The question was blunt, almost cruel in its clarity, but Neeson didn't flinch from it. Yes, he said simply. I chose the coward's path. I told myself I was protecting my marriage, my children, my career. But really, I was just protecting myself from having to be brave, from having to face hard truths and harder choices. And Joy paid the price for my weakness. The audience was completely still, hanging on every word. This had become something beyond celebrity gossip or daytime drama. This was a morality play unfolding in real time, a meditation on regret and consequences and the ways we hurt each other in the name of self-preservation. Joy pressed her fingers to her temples, a gesture of overwhelming emotion barely contained. Do you know what I did after the first month of silence? I convinced myself that something terrible must have happened to you. That you'd been in an accident, or had some family emergency, or were dealing with some crisis that prevented you from calling. Because the alternative, that you'd simply decided I wasn't worth the trouble, was too devastating to accept. Christ, Joy, Neeson whispered, and the profanity felt earned, necessary even, in the face of such painful honesty. I called the hospital where Natasha was working at the time, Joy continued, and this admission seemed to cost her something, the revelation of just how desperate she'd been. I pretended to be a colleague, asked if everything was okay with the Neeson family. The person I spoke to was confused, said everything was fine, that Natasha had just been talking about some wonderful vacation they were planning to Ireland. And that's when I knew. That's when I understood that I'd been nothing more than a momentary lapse in your otherwise intact life. Sonny Hostin's legal mind was working, trying to understand the full scope of what had transpired. Joy, you never told anyone about this. In all these years, working together, interviewing people who probably knew Liam, you never said anything. Joy shook her head. Who would I tell? And what would I say? That I'd had an affair with a married man who'd lied to me? That I'd been stupid enough to believe him when he said his marriage was over? I felt ashamed, Sonny. Ashamed of my gullibility, ashamed of my part in potentially hurting his family, ashamed that I'd let myself be so vulnerable with someone who clearly didn't value that vulnerability. But you weren't the one who was married, Alyssa interjected, her political background making her quick to assign appropriate responsibility. You weren't the one who made vows to someone else. Why did you carry the shame that was rightfully his? The question seemed to strike something deep in Joy, and tears finally spilled over, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. Because that's what women do, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We internalize the guilt for men's choices. We blame ourselves for being too trusting, too available, too much or not enough. And I knew better. I was already established in my career, not some starstruck kid. I should have known better. Neeson stood abruptly, startling everyone. For a moment, it seemed like he might walk off the set, unable to bear the weight of this public confrontation. But instead, he moved toward Joy, dropping to one knee beside her chair in a gesture so unexpected, so cinematically dramatic, that it felt both absurd and profoundly moving. Joy Behar, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. I am more sorry than I have words to express. You deserved honesty. You deserved respect. You deserved a man who was brave enough to either commit fully to what was happening between us or to end it with the dignity and clarity you were owed. Instead, you got my silence and my cowardice, and I have no excuse for that. None. The audience was crying now, audibly. The camera operators were struggling to keep their shots steady. Whoopi had given up trying to maintain any semblance of control over the segment, understanding that what was unfolding was bigger than her show, bigger than any of them. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, Joy said, looking down at Neeson's upturned face. I don't know how to process a public apology for a private hurt that I've lived with for so long that it's become part of who I am. I built walls, Liam. After you, I built such high walls around my heart that I nearly missed out on my marriage to Steve because I was so terrified of being that vulnerable again. I robbed you of your ability to trust, Neeson said, and the grief in his voice was palpable. I robbed you of the lightness you had that summer, the openness. And I'm sorrier for that than for anything else in my life. Joy reached out then, touching his weathered face with a gentleness that contradicted the anger that had started this confrontation. "I need you to understand something," she said softly. "I'm not looking for us to resurrect anything. That's not what this is about. But I needed you to know that you mattered to me. That what we had, however brief, however doomed, was real for me. And your silence made me question my own reality, my own worth, my own judgment for more than 2 decades." Neeson took her hand in both of his, and the intimacy of the gesture made several audience members gasp. "It was real for me too," he said. "That's what I've never been able to admit to anyone, not even myself until this very moment. It was real, and it terrified me, and I handled that terror in the worst possible way. Can you forgive me?" Neeson asked, and the vulnerability in his question was stark and total. "I'm not asking you to forget, or to say what I did was okay. But can you forgive me enough to let this go, to stop carrying it as a weight on your heart?" Joy was quiet for a long moment, and the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was clear and strong despite the tears still streaming down her face. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've been waiting 23 years for you to see me. To acknowledge that I existed, that what happened between us was real, that I wasn't crazy or delusional. And now that you have, yes, Liam, I can forgive you. Not because you deserve it necessarily, but because I deserve to be free of this. I deserve to stop letting your choices from 2 decades ago define how I see myself." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the manufactured enthusiasm of a typical talk show. This was genuine, cathartic, the sound of hundreds of people who had just witnessed something profound. Neeson stood, pulling Joy up with him, and they embraced, not romantically, but with the deep recognition of 2 people who had finally found closure. When they pulled apart, both were crying openly, and there wasn't a dry eye in the studio. Sawa was sobbing into a tissue. Sunny was wiping her face. Even Whoopi, who prided herself on maintaining composure, was visibly moved. "Well," Whoopi said, her voice cracking, "I think we can safely say this was not the interview we were expecting." The audience laughed through their tears, and the tension finally began to release. But the impact of what had just occurred was far from over. As the show cut to commercial, producers were already fielding calls from news outlets. Social media was exploding. The clip hadn't even finished airing. This was live television, but phones had been recording, and within minutes, snippets were circulating everywhere. The hashtag #JoyandLiam was trending before the commercial break had even ended. In the days that followed, the interview became a cultural phenomenon. Think pieces appeared in major publications analyzing everything from the gender dynamics of their confrontation to the ethics of airing such a raw moment on television. Psychologists discussed the importance of closure and the long-term impacts of emotional ghosting. Joy received thousands of messages from women sharing their own stories of being ghosted, of carrying the weight of rejection, of questioning their worth because someone they cared about had simply vanished. Men wrote too, some confessing their own cowardice in similar situations, others expressing gratitude for seeing masculine vulnerability modeled so publicly. The View experienced its highest ratings in 5 years. But more importantly, it sparked a broader conversation about how we treat each other in relationships, about the courage required for honesty, and about the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Joy and Liam didn't become friends after that day. They didn't need to. They had given each other something more valuable. They had given each other truth, acknowledgement, and the freedom that comes with genuine closure. 6 months later, Joy would mention in an interview that she felt lighter than she had in years. She'd stopped carrying that old hurt around like a secret shame. And Neeson began speaking more openly about regret, about the mistakes he'd made, about facing uncomfortable truths rather than running from them. The 17 minutes that changed everything became a touchstone moment in television history, not for scandal or spectacle, but for its unflinching honesty about human frailty and the power of speaking truth even when it's painful. Now it's your turn. What do you think about what went down between Joy and Liam? Was his apology enough? Should she have forgiven him? Have you ever been in a situation where someone from your past owed you an apology you never got? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and I want to know where you stand. And if you're not already subscribed to Prime Talk, what are you waiting for? We bring you the most dramatic, most real, most unforgettable celebrity moments that you won't find anywhere else. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and turn on notifications so you never miss another explosive story. This is Prime Talk, where we don't just report the drama, we take you inside it.